My son's retirement savings were $190,000. She had been inside his life for 5 months. She was 3 weeks from the ask, and she was at my dinner table, composed, warm, watching me the way a card player watches the door. When I understood what I was sitting across from, I set my fork down. I did not look at her again the same way. My son's name is Marcus. He is 33 and works in commercial insurance underwriting, a decade spent learning to read risk, price it correctly, and never let hope distort the number. He is precise by training and generous by nature, which is a combination that works well in almost every situation except this one. He had been single for 2 years before Renata, focused, not unhappy. When they met, he told us she was different in a way he didn't yet have words for. Patricia smiled at that. I said nothing. I was listening to the space between what he said and what he meant. Her name was Renata Vasic, 36, 5 months into a relationship with my son. By every visible measure, she was exceptional. Not in a way that performed itself, which is its own kind of tell, but quietly. She remembered that Patricia took her coffee black and asked about it without prompting the second visit. She asked Marcus questions at dinner that made him look thoughtful, the kind of questions built not to extract information, but to make a person feel properly seen. There is a difference between interest and attention. Real interest is slightly disorganized. It interrupts itself. It follows tangents and doubles back. What Renata offered was something more precise, calibrated in a way that felt like warmth, but functioned like intelligence gathering. She moved through a room the way certain experienced people move through rooms, gathering while appearing only to give. At that first dinner, she had asked me 4 questions about my work, specific ones. Not what do you do, but what kinds of cases had I found most difficult to prove. Not how long did you work in fraud, but what made someone good at it. The questions of a person building a map, not making conversation. I answered honestly and watched her absorb each response with the particular attentiveness of someone filing rather than listening. When I finished speaking, she held eye contact for exactly 1 beat longer than necessary before she turned back to Marcus. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself I was a man who had spent too long in rooms where charm was a tool and had lost the capacity to receive it as anything else. That my son had found someone genuine, and I was too professionally damaged to see it clearly. I held on to that story longer than I should have. My name is David Calloway, 59 years old, 14 years as a detective with the Edmonton Police Service, the last 6 in economic crimes. 15 years after that as a private fraud examiner, insurance companies, law firms, twice the federal government, following money that moved in ways that did not add up. 300 people defrauded. I sat across from most of them in the weeks after the damage was done. I also sat across from the people who defrauded them. There is something experienced operators share that is difficult to articulate. It is not confidence exactly. Confidence has a looseness to it, an ease that doesn't monitor itself. What these people have is more like the stillness of a thermostat, a constant invisible calibration. They are always reading the room and adjusting, and they have done it long enough that the adjustment is no longer visible as effort. After enough years of watching for it, you stop needing to analyze it consciously. You simply feel the calibration the way you feel the air pressure change before a storm, before there is anything visible in the sky. The laugh was the first thing. We were at dinner. Marcus was building toward the punchline of a story, a small absurdity involving a parking permit and 3 layers of office administration. He tells stories carefully, with good timing, and the table was with him. Patricia was already smiling. I was watching. Renata laughed a half-second too early. Not loudly, not in any way that disrupted the table, just a small sound, natural in quality, wrong in its placement, before the punchline had settled, before the full shape of the story had arrived. The laugh of someone whose body had heard a version of this story before and forgot to wait for the ending. Marcus finished. The table laughed. The moment passed. Renata touched his arm and said something quiet and warm, and he smiled. I kept eating. I said nothing, but I held it, the way you hold a stone that is slightly the wrong weight for its size. Not alarming, just off, just enough to keep. The second thing came 3 weeks later. Marcus and I were on the phone going through numbers on a property he was considering in the West End. 40 minutes, detailed, comfortable. At some point, Renata came into the room. I heard her voice in the background, heard Marcus mention what we were discussing. Then, light and offhand, I heard her say, "Oh, does your dad do that kind of thing?" I didn't realize he had a financial background. I asked Marcus 3 more questions about the property. I said goodnight. Then I sat in the kitchen with the light on and did not move for a while. The overhead light in our kitchen has a slight buzz that you stop hearing after a few minutes. I heard it the whole time I sat there. Because a woman who attended 2 family dinners and who at the first of them asked me specific, mapping questions about my professional background does not wonder casually, 11 weeks later, whether I have a financial background. Unless she has moved through so many similar rooms with so many similar people that the individual details have stopped holding their shape. When you have profiled enough targets, the specifics blur. The category remains. And I had just become a category again, not a person. Performance is not proof, but it has a structure, and I had just felt the structure shift beneath me. I stopped telling myself I was wrong. 2 weeks after that, at Sunday lunch, Marcus mentioned in passing that Renata had been talking to him about his pension. His employer's fund was irresponsibly conservative, she had told him. There were structures available to someone in his position, stable income, no dependents, 2 decades before retirement, that mainstream advisors actively suppressed because their revenue depended on keeping people in low-yield vehicles. She knew someone. A portfolio architect, she called him. Not an advisor, a portfolio architect. I asked Marcus how much was in the pension. He looked up with mild surprise. About $190,000, he said. Why? Just curious, I said. I changed the subject to something about the property he'd been looking at. Patricia looked at me from across the table. 34 years of marriage is its own language, one built from thousands of small moments that never required explanation. She did not ask anything. She just looked, and I looked back, and the entire shape of what I was thinking passed between us without a word. Later, after Marcus left and Patricia was washing up, she said without turning around, "How serious is it?" I said I didn't know yet. She dried her hands and turned and looked at me the way she has looked at me through every difficult thing in 34 years. Not asking me to reassure her, not asking me to be wrong, just asking me to be honest with her about the weight of it. I said, "Serious enough that I need to make some calls." She nodded once, and that was the whole conversation. That has always been enough between us. That evening, I opened a notebook I had not touched in over a year, since my last contracted case, a real estate syndication in Calgary that had cost 11 investors $2.5 million before the exit structure became visible. And I wrote down everything I knew about Renata Vasic. The first dinner observations, the laugh, the phone call, the phrase, portfolio architect. I wrote it twice and looked at it. In 29 years, I had heard the vocabulary of this work evolve through dozens of iterations. Private placement, alternative asset, non-correlated return, bespoke capital structure. Each generation of language arrives slightly ahead of the regulatory definitions, which is partly the point. Portfolio architect was new enough that it had not yet been attached to any case I knew of. New enough that if I searched it in conjunction with a fund name and a city, I would either find nothing or find exactly what I was looking for. I texted Helen Price at 9:30 that night. Helen had spent 22 years with the RCMP's Integrated Market Enforcement Team before moving to the British Columbia Securities Commission. We had worked adjacent to each other on a securities case 7 years ago, and she had, at a critical point in that investigation, shared access to information she was not strictly required to share. I had never forgotten it. She owed me nothing. But we understood each other's work, and in a field this specific, that understanding is its own kind of currency. She called at 7:15 the next morning. I gave her Renata's name, the firm name Marcus had mentioned, the phrase. Helen was quiet for a moment, not the silence of someone thinking, the silence of someone who has already begun. Then, give me until noon. While I waited, I called Robert Fenn, forensic accountant, 18 years with the Alberta Crown Prosecutor's Office, now in private practice. Robert had a particular gift that I had come to rely on across 3 referrals over the years. He could read a financial document and tell you not just whether the numbers were wrong, but how the document had been constructed to prevent you from noticing that they were wrong. The architecture of the deception, not just the deception itself. I described the fund structure Marcus had outlined. Robert asked 2 questions, both technical, both pointed. Then he said, "Whoever built this knows exactly what they are doing." That is not a reassurance. Coming from Robert in that tone, it is never a reassurance. Helen called at 11:40. Her voice carried the particular flatness I had learned over years to recognize. The register people move into when they have found something they were hoping was not there. 4 years earlier, Renata Vasic had been the subject of a complaint filed with the Alberta Securities Commission. A retired couple in Red Deer, school teachers in their late 60s, had moved $85,000 into a private investment vehicle at her recommendation. No registration. The money was partially recovered, $61,000, because one of them had kept a handwritten log of every conversation and every document exchanged. That log gave investigators enough to move before the transfer completed. No criminal charge, a settlement, no admission of wrongdoing. The brokerage let her go 6 weeks after the settlement. Their internal notes described her conduct as inconsistent with client relationship standards. I sat with that phrase. The brokerage's lawyers had spent considerable effort arriving at language that said everything necessary while committing to nothing actionable. It is a specific skill, that kind of precise evasion, and I have encountered it enough times to read through it clearly. What it meant was, we know. We cannot prove it the way a court requires, and we are not willing to carry the liability of saying it plainly. $24,000 did not come back to those 2 people in Red Deer. I had been in enough rooms with people who had lost that kind of money to know that the number is never the full account. The number is what shows up in a regulatory filing. What does not show up is the particular quality of loss that arrives when a person discovers that someone who remembered their name, who asked about their life, who made them feel briefly less invisible, was running a calculation the entire time. The attention was the instrument. The warmth was the delivery mechanism. And the money was simply what the instrument was designed to collect. That specific damage, the damage to a person's understanding of their own judgment, their own ability to read another human being, does not appear in any settlement document. It simply lives in a person, quietly, for a very long time. Is the fund registered anywhere? I asked. Helen was already ahead of me. Not in Alberta, not in any province. A company by that name had been federally incorporated 14 months ago. The registered director was a numbered company in Saskatchewan. The address was a shared office space in downtown Calgary, $90 a month, a glass door, a placard on a directory that nobody walked past with any intention of entering. Unregistered does not mean technical. It means unprotected. It means that if the money moves and the structure dissolves, there is no regulatory floor, no deposit insurance, no investor recourse mechanism of any kind. The investor is not a client in any protected sense. They are simply a person who wired money to an account. I drove to Marcus's apartment that afternoon without calling ahead. He met me at the door. He saw from the way I had arrived the particular set of a person who has come with a purpose rather than a visit, that something had shifted. We sat at his kitchen table. He made coffee neither of us touched. Outside the kitchen window, the afternoon light was going flat in the way it does in October, when the sun drops early and the city takes on a gray that is not quite shadow. I had been in this kitchen many times. I knew the faint sound the building's ventilation made, a low hum that was always there beneath the silence. Marcus sat across from me with his hands on the table, very still. I told him everything in the correct order. The Red Deer couple first, the handwritten log, the partial recovery, the $24,000 that did not come back, before I said anything about fund registration or Calgary addresses. I wanted him to understand what Renata was before he processed what the investment structure was. The person had to be clear before the mechanism could be understood. Otherwise, the mechanism becomes the whole story, and the mechanism is not the whole story. He listened without interrupting. He has always had this quality, receiving difficult information without flinching away from it or rushing toward a response. He gets it from his mother. Patricia can sit with an uncomfortable truth until she has understood its full shape before she decides what to do with it. Marcus inherited this precisely, and it has served him in his work, and it served him now. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. He looked at the coffee mug in front of him, the one he hadn't touched. Then he said, "She told me last week she thought she might be falling in love with me." I did not say anything. I did not say anything because there was nothing I could offer that would change the specific gravity of that sentence. He needed to sit with it in the room, with the full weight of what it meant now that he knew what he knew. The particular and disorienting experience of discovering that something built to feel real was built, with skill and patience and considerable prior experience, specifically to feel that way. The skill does not make the feeling false. The feeling was real. That is precisely what makes the situation so much harder than a simple financial crime. He had not been robbed, he had been cultivated. And the difference between those two things is the difference between a broken lock and a door you opened yourself. After a while, he looked up. His jaw was set in the way it gets when he has absorbed something and moved past the initial impact of it into what comes next. He said, "What do I need to do?" I explained it carefully. In Alberta, a person can record a conversation they are a party to without notifying the other party. The recording is legally admissible. What I needed was one more meeting, Marcus and Renata, and her complete investment pitch on audio. The fund name, the projected returns, the transfer mechanism, the account details, the timeline. His phone in his breast pocket, recorder running, his conversation, his record. He would need to appear close to yes, not eager. Eager is visible, and people who do this work are trained to read the difference. Close simply reduces the remaining distance, and that kind of operator is conditioned to close distance themselves. They do not need to be pulled. They need to see the gap narrowing. He asked if I thought he could do it. I told him he had already been doing something harder for 5 months. He had been carrying a feeling he could not yet name, functioning normally in the relationship, eventually reaching out rather than building a more comfortable internal narrative. Most people, when the discomfort of doubt becomes difficult enough, find a way to resolve it on terms that cost them less in the near term. They construct a reason to be wrong about what they feel. Marcus had not done that. He had let the feeling stay uncomfortable until he found somewhere to bring it. That is not a small thing. He called her that evening, said he had been thinking seriously about the portfolio conversation and wanted to sit down before the month-end deadline she had mentioned. She was warm and unhurried. "Of course," she said. "Thursday afternoon, coffee near his office." She said she was glad he was taking it seriously. The ease of that response, no hesitation, no adjustment in register, the immediate warmth, told me everything I needed to know about where she believed things stood. She had no reason to think anything had changed, which meant we had not moved too quickly and had not tipped anything. We were still in position. Thursday morning, I arrived at Marcus's apartment at 8. We sat at the kitchen table again, the same two chairs, the same flat October light coming through the window. I walked him through the mechanics one more time. Phone in the breast pocket of his jacket, screen facing inward, voice memo running before he walked in. Let her set the pace of the conversation. Do not fill pauses. People who are selling something fill silence themselves, and that filled silence is often where the most useful material appears. Ask clarifying questions in a completely neutral register. What is the name of the fund again? How does the transfer process work? What happens to the funds once they arrive? These are not suspicious questions. They are the questions of a man who is nearly ready and wants to understand what he is agreeing to. He nodded through all of it with the focused attention he has always brought to things that matter. I asked how he was doing. He looked at his hands on the table for a moment. Then he said, I keep going back to the woman in Red Deer, the one who kept the handwritten record of every conversation. He paused. I'm not sure why that's the part I keep returning to. I told him I thought he knew exactly why. He did not respond. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, checked that the phone was where it needed to be, and left. I drove home through mid-morning traffic that was heavier than usual. The city had the particular noise of a weekday in motion. Buses, construction somewhere to the north, the low, constant sound of 10,000 things happening at once. I found it easier than silence that morning. Patricia was at the kitchen table with a book open in front of her that she was not reading. She had known since Tuesday. When I first told her, she had asked one question, is Marcus going to be all right? And when I said yes, she had gone quiet in the particular way she does when she has decided to trust me on something that costs her something to trust. Not blind trust, considered trust. The kind that has been tested and maintained across 3.5 decades and has its own specific weight. She did not ask me anything when I came in. She looked up from the book and I sat down across from her, and we stayed there for a few minutes without speaking. Then she got up and put the kettle on, and we had tea, and still did not talk about it much, because there was nothing more to say that would help, and both of us understood that. We sat in the kitchen the rest of that morning and into the afternoon. She made soup at some point that neither of us tasted particularly. We listened to the radio. The light moved across the kitchen floor the way it does in late October, lower and slower than it will be for months. At 9:47 that night, Marcus texted, "Done, heading home, calling in 20. His voice on the phone 23 minutes later was controlled, but stripped of the surface layer that composure requires. The sound of a person who has been holding a particular kind of stillness for 2 hours and has finally set it down. She had delivered the complete pitch. Projected annual returns of 16 to 20%. That number carries a specific meaning in the context of legitimate investment markets. It does not signal opportunity. It signals the absence of any real underlying structure, because no registered fund produces those figures with consistency across market cycles. And anyone telling you otherwise is not describing an asset. They are describing what they need you to believe in order for the next step to work. She had named the account, a credit union in Alberta. The portfolio architect preferred working outside the major banks, she had explained, because of processing speed. The big institutions added administrative friction that slowed capital deployment. His funds would be active within 96 hours of transfer. 96 hours. I had seen this timeline before, in different configurations, across different schemes. By the time any account is identified as fraudulent, and the layering process, the movement of funds through multiple intermediary accounts to obscure origin and destination, is traced backward to something legible. 96 hours is not a window. It is a completed exit. The money is not recoverable in any practical sense. It exists in fragments across institutions in multiple jurisdictions, and reconstructing the path takes months of forensic accounting work that the victims pay for with their own time and resources, at the end of which they often receive a number that is accurate and useless. I called Helen at 10:15. She asked Marcus to send the audio file to a secure address. He did within the hour. She listened to it overnight. She called me at 7 the next morning. Her voice was level and brief. She said, "It is enough. We are moving today." Renata Vasic was taken into custody at a parkade near her apartment on a Friday morning before 9 o'clock. I know because Marcus called me while it was happening. He had gone outside, was standing on the pavement in the cold, and his voice when he spoke was very quiet. "It's happening, Dad," he said. "Good," I said. "Walk. Get some air. I'll be here when you're ready." The investigation that followed established that she had operated the same core approach in 2 other provinces before Alberta. The fund names changed with each iteration. The title shifted. Portfolio architect in one province, capital strategist in another, wealth architect before that. The language evolved the way language evolves when a person is managing regulatory exposure while maintaining operational continuity. What did not change was the foundational architecture, patient relationship building preceding any financial conversation, with the emotional investment functioning as the actual delivery mechanism for the eventual ask. Across 7 confirmed cases, the total attempted losses exceeded $1.4 million. The partial recovery in Red Deer remained the only money any confirmed victim had gotten back. Marcus was the first person across all of her known cases who had not lost a single dollar. 6 weeks after the arrest, Marcus came for Sunday dinner. Just the 3 of us. Patricia made the slow braised lamb with herbs from the kitchen window, rosemary and thyme she grows in small clay pots along the sill. The same dish she has been making since Marcus was 12 and declared it his favorite without qualification and has never revised that assessment. We ate and talked about other things. A renovation Marcus was considering, a trip Patricia wanted to plan in the spring, a book I had been reading about a polar expedition that had gone badly, and then, improbably, somewhat right. The ordinary texture of an evening, the particular medicine of it. After Patricia went to call her sister, Marcus sat across from me at the table with both hands around his tea. The kitchen had gone quiet in the way kitchens go quiet after dinner, when the work of it is done and what remains is just the warmth and the light. After a while, he said, "I keep going back to the moment during her pitch when I knew she had the collateral structure wrong, about how private credit facility collateral actually works. I know enough from underwriting to know she had it backwards." I almost said something. He stopped. I don't know why I didn't. I looked at my son across the kitchen table. I thought about the version of him that sat in the backseat of a car at 11 years old, deciding whether to trust what his father was telling him. I thought about how far that boy had carried himself to become the person sitting across from me now. I told him I thought he did know why he had stayed quiet, that some part of him had understood in that moment that the next sentence, the correction, the reveal that he had been listening more carefully than she knew, would close a door he was not yet ready to close. Not because he had any remaining doubt about what she was, but because closing that door would make permanent and irreversible something he had been hoping for 5 months was not what it appeared to be. Staying quiet for that half-minute was not a failure of nerve. It was the last act of a man trying to hold open a possibility that the evidence had already decided. He nodded slowly. He was very casually, whether I had ever thought very casually, whether I had ever thought about moving my RRSP into something more actively managed. I told her I was happy with where it was. She didn't push. She just said, "That makes sense. Not everyone's comfortable with that kind of complexity." And then she changed the subject. He looked at his tea. I remember thinking that was a strange thing to say. Not everyone's comfortable with that kind of complexity. Like she was already positioning me as someone who might resist because I didn't understand, not because I had a reason. He paused. I told myself I was overthinking it. I said, "You weren't." He said, "I know that now. I think I knew it then too, but you tell yourself a lot of things when you don't want the explanation that's in front of you to be the right one. That is perhaps the most honest sentence I have heard in a long time about how these situations work from the inside. The explanation is often visible before a person is ready to accept it. The interval between seeing and accepting is where the damage usually happens. Marcus's interval had been long enough to produce discomfort, but short enough to preserve what mattered. He had reached out before the window closed. He said, "I called you because I didn't know if I was right." I said, "I know. That is exactly the condition under which a person should call." There are things I want to say plainly, as someone who has spent 30 years watching damage that was preventable accumulate in ways that left people permanently diminished. Fraud of this kind does not seek out foolish people. It seeks out open ones. The most capable operators in this space invest genuinely before they take anything. Time, attention, the small remembered detail that makes a person feel known. By the time any financial conversation begins, the relationship already has weight and texture and real history. That is not a side effect. It is the design. The emotional architecture is what makes the investment pitch possible. Without it, the document is just a document. With it, the document arrives inside something the target has already decided to trust, which is precisely why the early warning signs feel, from the inside, like the paranoia of a person who doesn't know how to be in a relationship. The warning signs are quiet. They live in the space between what someone says and how they say it, in a laugh that arrives a half second too early, in a question that maps rather than connects. Most people, even people who notice these things, decide they are imagining them. Returns consistently above 8 to 10% annually are not a feature of a legitimate investment structure. They are evidence of the absence of a real underlying structure, because real assets in real markets do not behave that way with consistency. Any fund not verifiable through the Canadian Securities Administrators database at securities-administrators.ca operates outside every investor protection mechanism that exists in this country, not as a technicality, but as a fundamental reality. A deadline that expires at the end of the month is not a market condition. It is a pressure instrument as deliberately engineered as any other element of the approach. And any investment structure described in language that sounds precise but refers to nothing verifiable, private credit facilities secured by physical assets, alternative structures backed by real property, is what a forensic accountant once described to me as a sentence dressed as a building. The grammar is load-bearing, nothing else is. Ask for the registration number and verify it independently. Ask for audited financial statements from a named, verifiable auditing firm. Ask to have every document reviewed by a legal or financial professional you chose and whose fee you are paying. Any structure that is what it claims to be can withstand those requests without hesitation. Any structure that resists them, that characterizes those requests as unnecessary friction or a sign of insufficient trust, is using the language of the relationship to protect the mechanics of the scheme. If someone in your life reaches out to you, in whatever form, with whatever they have available, be present enough to receive it. Not helpful, not immediately problem-solving, simply present. Marcus did not arrive at my door with a file and a clear account of what was wrong. He arrived with a feeling he could not fully name yet and needed someone outside the situation to look at what he could see. The reaching out itself was the act that made everything else possible. Not what I knew, not the contacts I had, the phone call, the willingness to say, "I'm not sure I'm right, but something feels wrong, and I trust you enough to tell you." We did not lose a dollar. I want to be precise about why. Not because I intervened, though I did. Not because I had the right contacts, though I did. But because a 33-year-old man sat at a Sunday dinner, heard something land at the wrong angle in a room full of people who heard nothing land wrong at all. And instead of constructing a comfortable explanation for the angle, instead of deciding he was being unfair to someone he cared about, he made a call. He made it not knowing if he was right. He made it willing to be wrong. He made it because the discomfort of the uncertainty was finally greater than the discomfort of saying it out loud to someone he trusted. Everything else followed from that moment, not from what I knew, not from 30 years in this work, from what he trusted enough to say. And that is the thing I find myself returning to, more than the investigation, more than the arrest, more than the 7 confirmed cases or the 1.4 million in attempted losses that a woman who remembered which coffee order belonged to which person had left behind her in 3 provinces. I returned to the kitchen, the untouched coffee, the October light going flat through the window, my son sitting across from me, jaw set, having already moved past the worst of what I had just told him and into what came next. "What do I need to do?" he said. That sentence, that particular sentence, asked in that particular way, by a person who had just been handed information that most people would have needed days to move through. That is who my son is. That has always been who my son is. I just needed this specific situation to make it fully visible.